She rode to town to sell her last wool shawl. A cattle baron bought it and wrapped her in it. The shawl was on the counter before I even crossed the threshold. I'd come in for coffee. Dellerman kept a pot on the back iron, and he knew I took it black. And the mercantile was quiet that morning, early enough that the flour dust from yesterday was still settling out of the light. I nearly didn't notice her. She was standing with her back to the door, both hands flat on the counter, and she'd laid the shawl out between them the way you'd lay a deed or a promissory note, like she was presenting evidence, like she needed it to be seen and judged before she could get the words out. Dellerman was holding one corner, turning it over. He had the look he got when he knew the price would insult someone, and he was working up the courage to say it anyway. I set my hat on the nail by the door and walked to the coffee pot. She said quietly, "It's good wool, merino. My mother brought the ewe from Pennsylvania." He said, "I can see that, ma'am." She said, "What I'm asking is fair." He said, "Well." That one word, I'd heard Dellerman say it 100 times, it meant no. I poured my coffee and I didn't look at her. I looked at the shawl. It was dark green with a border worked in rust and brown, and the weave was tight enough that you could tell the hands that made it had known what they were doing. Not store goods, something made at night by lamplight over years. You don't sell something like that because you want to. You sell it because the wall is right there, and you've got nowhere left to go. I said, "What's she asking, Del?" He looked at me. He said a number. It was fair. It was more than fair. He said, "Mr. Calloway, I don't need." "Double it," I said. "I'll take it." She turned then. I hadn't seen her face yet, and I suppose I was braced for gratitude or embarrassment or some mix of the two. That particular expression women get when a man steps in and they can't decide whether to be relieved or offended. But she wasn't either. She was looking at me the way you look at a man you're trying to read, careful and level, and she had dark eyes and a face that had seen weather and hadn't hidden from it. She was maybe 40, maybe a little past. There was a line at the corner of her mouth that could have been tiredness, or could have been the shape she made when she was about to say something she meant. She said, "I don't know you." I said, "No." "Why would you do that?" It wasn't really a question. I pulled out the money and laid it on the shawl and picked the shawl up and held it out to her. She didn't take it. She looked at it. She looked at me. I said, "It's cold. You rode in this morning. You didn't have it on, and it's cold." She said, "I rode in to sell it." "I know." "Then why?" "Because," I said, "I've got 3,000 head of cattle and a house big enough to sleep a regiment, and I haven't spent money on anything that mattered in 11 years, and that shawl matters." I set it on the counter between us and picked up my coffee. "Do with it what you want." I went and sat by the window. She stood there a good long while. I watched Main Street and drank my coffee. I heard her say something quiet to Dellerman, and I heard him answer. And then I heard her footsteps, not toward the door, toward me, and I looked up, and she was standing there with the shawl folded over her arm and the money in her hand, all of it, and she set the money on the table in front of me. She said, "I don't take charity." I said, "Neither do I." She said, "Then what would you call that?" I said, "I'd call it a man who wanted a shawl and bought one. I'm giving it back to you because it suits you better than it suits me." Something crossed her face. Not softness exactly, more like she was reconsidering the angle she'd taken. She pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. She said, "My name is Ada Fenn." Her husband had been dead 2 years. He'd gone out to check the east fence in a late April storm, and the horse had come back without him, and by the time they found him the ground was frozen. She had 400 acres in the foothills, a small herd she'd been building since she was 22, a well that was sinking, and a son, 14, who was doing a man's work but was not yet a man. She told me this without complaint. She told it the way you tell the facts of a thing when you need someone to have the facts, not as a bid for sympathy. I asked a few questions and she answered them straight. She drank her coffee when Dellerman brought it and she thanked him by name. I had a fair picture of the land by the time we were done. I knew the foothills east of town. I'd ridden through her property line maybe 15 years ago when I was buying range. Grass was good there if you managed it right. Water was the problem, always was in that drainage. I said, "Your well, how far down is it now?" She named a depth. I said, "You need to go another 30 feet. There's a shelf there. Once you hit it, you'll have water through any dry year I've seen." She said, "Driller's fee." "I know a man who owes me a favor. He's good and he's honest, and I'll send him out Tuesday if you're willing." She looked at me for a long time. She said, "Why?" I set my cup down. Outside, a freight wagon was working its way up the street, and the mules were making their opinions known. I said, "Mrs. Fenn, I'm 53 years old. I built this ranch from nothing and it's mine, and it runs well and it will run well after I'm dead. What I don't have is a reason to get up before the sun, except that the cattle need feeding and the men expect me there. I'm not telling you that to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because you asked a fair question, and that's the fair answer." She didn't look away. She said, "That's a very honest thing to say." I said, "I've got past the age where dishonesty saves any time." She almost smiled. Almost. There was just that pull at the corner of her mouth, that shape I'd noticed when she first turned around. She said, "I'll think about the well." She put the shawl on. She picked up the money from the table and put it in her coat pocket and stood up and buttoned the coat over the shawl and straightened it. And for a moment she looked, I don't know the word, restored maybe, like something had been returned to its right place. She put her hand out and I shook it. Her grip was firm and her palm was calloused, and she met my eyes when she did it. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." I watched her ride out. The shawl was a dark green flag at her back against the gray morning, and the bare cottonwoods and I stood on the boardwalk and watched until she turned off Main, and I couldn't see her any more. I went back inside and told Dellerman I'd be needing another cup. The well driller man named Prout rode out the following Tuesday. I sent him with a note, nothing in it except that I'd guaranteed his fee, and that if he gave her any trouble she should send word and I'd sort it out. I got a note back 3 days later, delivered by her boy, a long-legged kid named Thomas who had his mother's eyes and his father's silences. The note said the drilling had begun, and thank you, and she enclosed Prout's first payment. Her own money. I kept that note. Thomas rode out to the Calloway spread a second time the following week. This one not a note, but a question. His mother wanted to know if I'd be willing to look at the east fence line and advise her on the repair. There were 600 yards of it down, and she had the wire and the posts, but she wasn't sure the angle of the terrain, and she didn't want to waste material on a line that wouldn't hold. I went the next morning. The land was what I remembered: good grass, south-facing, the kind of slope that shed water clean without washing the topsoil out. The fence was down in 3 sections, and I could see why. The posts had been put in too shallow and the frost had pushed them. Rookie mistake, which meant her husband had done it in a hurry or she'd done it herself without knowing better, and neither thing was her fault. She was already on horseback when I got there, Thomas at her side. She'd been riding fence herself, checking the damage. She pointed out the worst sections and told me what she had in materials, and I told her what I'd do differently and why. And she listened the way you listen when you're actually tracking the logic, not just waiting for the person to stop talking. Thomas asked good questions. I answered them straight. We rode the full east line by midday. Then she had me in for coffee. The house was small and clean, and there were books on a shelf by the window and a photograph on the mantel of a younger version of her and a man who must have been her husband, both of them squinting into the sun, both of them grinning. And we sat at the kitchen table, and she had cold cornbread and venison left from supper, and she put it in front of me without asking whether I wanted it. I ate it. It was good. Thomas excused himself to do the afternoon chores, and we sat and talked for a while about the fence, and then about the cattle market, and then about nothing in particular. She'd been raised in Ohio. She'd come west at 19 with her husband, who'd had a scheme and the energy for it, and had spent the first 4 years proving it could work. She'd learned to ride and brand and pull a calf, and set a fence post and read the weather coming off the mountains, and she'd done it all willingly, because the land was real, and the work was real, and that was what she'd wanted. She said, "I think some people are built for the easy life, and some people aren't." I said, "Which kind are you?" She said, "I thought I was both for a while. I'm not." I said, "No, me either." We sat with that for a minute. She said, "Do you miss it, the building it up part?" I looked out the window at her south pasture. The grass was winter pale, but it would come back good in April if the snow came right. I said, "Every day." I came back the following Saturday to help pull the fence posts and reset them right. I brought 2 of my hands, good men, Olivares and a young fellow named Birch, and the 3 of us had the first section redone by noon. Thomas worked alongside us and held up his end. Ada brought water out at 10 and stood and watched us work for a few minutes and then went back to the house without a word. Birch made some remark under his breath, something admiring, and Olivares told him to mind his manners, and he did. We finished the east line in 2 days. The 3rd day I came back alone to check the corner posts, and she was outside splitting wood, and I took the maul from her without asking and did it myself, and she sat on the chopping block and watched me and didn't argue. When I was done, she said, "You're going to wear yourself out riding out here every other day." I said, "My schedule permits it." She said, "Calloway." I said, "What?" She said, "What is it you're after?" I set them all down. The woodpile was substantial now. The air smelled like pine sap and horse and the particular cold clarity you get at 4,000 feet in January. I said, "I told you, back in the mercantile." She said, "A reason to get up before the sun." I said, "Something like that." She looked at me for a while. The line at the corner of her mouth was there. She wasn't smiling exactly, but she wasn't not. She said, "You know this is not a simple situation." I said, "I know." She said, "Thomas." I said, "He's a good kid." She said, "He's everything I have left." I said, "I know that too." She looked away, toward the pasture. A pair of her cattle had come up near the fence line and were standing there being stupid in the cold the way cattle do. She said, "He liked you." I said, "He asked good questions." She said, "He asked me last night who you were. I said you were a neighbor helping with the fence. He said you didn't act like a neighbor helping with a fence. He said you acted like—" She stopped. I said, "Like what?" She said, "He said you acted like a man who was figuring out if he belonged somewhere." I didn't say anything for a minute. I said, "Smart kid." She looked back at me. The wind came off the slope and moved her hair, and she didn't bother with it. She said, "Come to supper Saturday. Bring nothing, just come." I came to supper Saturday, and the Saturday after that. In February, the Prute well came in at 34 feet below where the old one had stopped, and the water was clean and cold, and Ada walked out to it and cupped her hands and drank from it and looked up at me and didn't say anything, just nodded once, and that nod was worth more to me than a deed. The ranch hands figured it out before any of us named it. Olivares started calling her place the East Spread when he talked about it, and nobody corrected him. Birch volunteered for any work that needed doing there, which I suspected had less to do with neighborly spirit than with the fact that Ada fed whoever worked for her, and she fed them well. Thomas started showing up at my place once or twice a week on the pretense of asking questions about cattle management, and I started having answers ready. In March, there was a situation with a man named Dougal who'd been running cattle onto her north pasture and claiming the fence line was wrong. He had 2 men with him when he rode up to her yard. She was alone. Thomas was in town at the schoolhouse, and she'd met them in the yard with a rifle across her arm, not raised, just there, which I later thought showed better nerve than most men I knew. She sent word to me, and I rode over that evening. Dougal was known to me. He was the kind of man who tested whatever fence he found and pushed through wherever the fence was weak. He was not going to test mine. I rode to his place the next morning, and I told him how it was going to be. I was not loud about it, and I was not long about it. I told him the fence line was where it was supposed to be, and it would stay there. And if his cattle showed up on her north pasture again, I would not send word. I would simply deduct the trespass fee from his account at the bank, where he owed me money on a note I had not yet called in. I told him he had until end of day to choose whether we were going to have a problem. He chose no problem. I told Ada that evening. She listened, and she didn't thank me effusively, didn't make a production of it. She said, "He'll try again. Men like that always do." I said, "He'll try me again too. He won't get any further." She said, "I know." She was looking at me while she said it, and the knowing in it was not just about Dougal. I let it sit. Thomas was at the table. He was reading, or pretending to. She said, "Supper in 10 minutes." In April, when the grass came in and the cattle were moving to the upper pasture, and the foothills were green in a way that made the whole country look like it was starting over, she said it plain. We were on horseback, the two of us, riding the ridge above her south pasture, and she'd stopped to look at the view valley floor to the east, her land below us and mine beyond it, the whole thing open and pale gold in the late afternoon light, and she said, "I've been thinking." I waited. She said, "I'm not a woman who needs rescuing." I said, "No." She said, "I was managing." I said, "You were. You'd have figured out the well, fixed the fence. Handled Dougal." She said, "Probably." I said, "Definitely." She said, "So I want you to understand that when I say what I'm about to say, I'm not saying it because I needed you." I looked at her. The wind was up on the ridge, and she had her hair back, and the shawl, the dark green shawl, was around her shoulders over her coat, and she'd taken to wearing it when she rode, and I'd never said anything about it and never would. She said, "I'm saying it because I want to, because I've thought about it long enough to know the difference." I said, "All right." She said, "I'm glad you came to that mercantile." I said, "So am I." She said, "I'm glad you're stubborn." I said, "I've been told that's not necessarily a virtue." She said, "It is, the right kind of stubborn. The kind that just keeps showing up." I didn't say anything. Below us, on the south pasture, I could see a handful of her cattle and a handful of mine mixed in at the fence line, grazing together the way they'd started doing when the fence was down for repair, and we just let them. We'd talked about whether to separate them back out, and neither of us had gotten around to it. She said, "Thomas asked me last week if you were going to stay." I said, "What did you tell him?" She said, "I told him I didn't know. I told him I hoped so." I said, "What did he say?" She said, "He said good. He said he'd been trying to figure out how to ask you himself, but he couldn't work out the right way to put it." We sat up there on that ridge for a while. The light was going amber, and then rose, and then the kind of deep red that only comes for about 15 minutes before the sun drops, and you don't get it back. She reached over and put her hand on my forearm. Just set it there, firm and warm through my coat sleeve, the way you'd lay a hand on something you intended to keep. I covered it with my own hand. She said, "Come to supper." I said, "I'll come to supper." Below us the cattle moved slow in the last of the light, hers and mine together, and the grass was green and the water in the new well was cold and clean, and the shawl was on her shoulders where it belonged, and that was enough. More than enough. It was the whole thing, right there, the ridge, the valley, the light going out slow over land that was starting to be ours, and a woman beside me who'd chosen to be there because she wanted to be, which was the only way I'd ever wanted to be chosen. I hadn't known that until she did it. But I knew it now.